The cameras hum quietly beneath the studio lights. Barbara Walters sits across from John and Patsy Ramsey, her eyes calm but unrelenting. Their faces are familiar. The Christmas photo, the house in Boulder, the story everyone thinks they already know. When Barbara begins, her voice is measured, almost gentle. She explains that when she mentioned interviewing them, the reaction from friends was identical. They're guilty. Patsy's hands tighten in her lap. John stares straight ahead. He says he understands that people have been told that by the media for 3 long years. He sounds exhausted but controlled. He says he's amazed the whole world doesn't think they're guilty, given what's been reported. Barbara doesn't soften. She lists the reasons people believe they're responsible. The pageants, the images of a little girl in glitter and lipstick beneath bright stage lights. To many, Barbara says, it looked inappropriate, and if it looked wrong, something must have been wrong at home. Patsy shakes her head and answers that any sense of that comes from the viewer, not the child. JonBenet loved to perform, she says. She was an entertainer who would sing or dance at the drop of a hat. Little girls play dress-up. They like sparkle. That's all it was. Barbara presses. Patsy herself had been a contestant. Patsy's face softens for the first time. She talks about being Miss West Virginia, about how wonderful that time was. She smiles, saying it's no different from a father who loved baseball sharing the game with his child. For a moment, her voice lifts, almost joyful. Then Barbara asks whether it was really for JonBenet's happiness or for hers. The smile fades. The brightness leaves her eyes, and she looks suddenly guarded again. The tension thickens. John leans forward slightly, protective, but Barbara continues. She moves to motive. Investigators, she says, once suggested there were physical findings that raised questions. Perhaps something terrible occurred that night, perhaps by accident. John's jaw tightens. He says the idea is absurd, that as best he can know as a father, his daughter was never mistreated. He says it makes no sense that a person doesn't live a normal life one day and suddenly turn into someone capable of great harm the next. There was no history, he says, no pattern. Barbara notes that the examination results left room for interpretation. John insists he would have given his life for his child, that to be accused of hurting her is beyond comprehension. For a moment, the room feels still except for the faint buzz of the lights. He looks down, voice catching, and the camera moves closer to his face. Then Barbara turns to Patsy. Authorities have said they might have staged the scene, she tells them, that the bindings and cord were arranged to appear like a kidnapping. Patsy looks startled, almost offended. She says that's absurd, that a terrible person did this, that the marks were real and severe. John adds that he tried to loosen the knots and couldn't. Barbara asks why he would try if it was supposed to look staged. John says exactly that it makes no sense. If he had staged something, he would have left it as it was. His answer sounds rational, but the air in the room is heavy with disbelief. He recounts finding her that morning, removing tape, carrying her upstairs. He says he tried to free her before bringing her up. He seems to be reliving it, but the logic feels strange. People watching years later would argue about this moment. Why focus on the knots instead of calling for help? Was it shock, or a story rehearsed too many times? The footage doesn't give away the truth. It just shows a father describing something no parent should ever experience. Barbara moves on. Another theory, she says, is that JonBenet had an accident in the night, that it caused frustration and one of them lost their temper. Patsy cuts her off. Absolutely not, she says. All children have accidents. It's insignificant. Barbara keeps pressing. Maybe exhaustion, maybe anger. Patsy shakes her head. She reminds Barbara that she survived stage 4 illness, that John had already lost another child in a car crash. When you've stood at the edge like that, she says, little things stop mattering. Bedwetting is nothing. She says she loved her children and would never harm them. Her voice wavers, but she doesn't cry. John watches her closely, his arm behind her chair. Barbara pauses, then asks if they ever suspected each other. John answers immediately, no, not for a second. Patsy agrees. John mentions that a detective once asked him the same question and that he told the man not to go there, that if he'd ever believed his wife was involved, they wouldn't be having this conversation. He's firm, almost offended that it's even asked. Barbara notes that Burke, their 9-year-old son, had been cleared by investigators. He was said not to have the strength or ability to compose the note found in the house. John's older children weren't even in Colorado that night, but the parents, always the parents, remained the focus. The ransom note became the next point of attack. It had been written on Patsy's stationery with her pen inside the house. 2.5 pages. Barbara asks the question everyone asks. If it was an outsider, why write a note there? Why not bring one? John answers that the less an intruder carried in, the better. Whoever did it, he says, likely planned to write it beforehand. Patsy adds that handwriting experts couldn't conclusively match her writing to the note. Some thought there were similarities, but results varied widely. She says that on a 5-point scale, she scored near the end, meaning little or no match. Law enforcement sources later confirmed the similarity reports had been exaggerated. Barbara listens, then points out the contradiction. If it was meant as a kidnapping, why was the child left behind along with the note? John says they believe it started as a kidnapping that went wrong. He calls the person responsible a creature, says, "You can't apply logic to someone like that." His tone grows cold again, distant, as if he's reasoning with something inhuman. Outside the interview, analysts would debate the story. How could an intruder sneak in, roam the house, find the child, take her downstairs, write a long note, and leave unseen? How could an entire household sleep through it? It strained belief, yet the alternative, that the Ramseys themselves were somehow involved, was no easier to prove. The case sat tangled between both ideas, full of contradictions. Everyone grasping at fragments that never fit. Barbara's questions keep circling, pressing against reason. She points out how long it would take to commit the act, to write the note, to move the child. Only the Ramseys, she says, had both time and opportunity. John insists the person waited inside the house for hours, maybe entered while they were gone, maybe before they returned from the Christmas party. He sounds certain, but his certainty raises more questions than it answers. The studio grows quiet. Barbara glances down at her notes, then back at them. The couple looks drained, their faces drawn tight under the glare. They've repeated these answers for years, and still they seem trapped in the same loop: sorrow, accusation, denial. The air feels heavy with what can't be proved, and that's where the story rests. 2 parents, one mystery that refuses to fade, and a nation that still can't decide what to believe. The interview keeps rolling, but every answer circles back to the same place: a tragedy frozen in time and a family still pleading to be understood.
So what I feel like from a behavioral lens is happening here is a textbook case of framing. The audience isn't interpreting facts at this point. They're interpreting signals. You have tone of voice, you have facial expressions, the contrast between grief and composure. I feel like all of it becomes emotional data that we can analyze. When people saw the pageants, the dresses, the family's wealth, their brains built a shortcut. Like, this feels off, like something must be off, okay? And that's something called availability bias, where we tend to judge the truth by whatever images and emotions come to mind first, okay? So we're looking at the Ramseys. We're already framing them before they spoke, right? The media is showing the pageant, the clips, The house, the money, the perfect looking family, everything is in its place like it's supposed to be, in my opinion. So once those associations formed, every calm answer is sounding suspicious, right? It's the same principle marketers use. Change the frame, change the interpretation. Old school textbook marketing, right? And that's what's so fascinating about this first part here is that the interview isn't just about guilt or even innocent. It's about the psychology of presentation. It's about how they're presenting, how they're making everything look, how they're narrating and driving a story for everybody to see, right? The same body language that would be considered strong, quote unquote, in a CEO looks cold in a grieving parent, right? Two different situations, the same sort of body language, two different perceptions, right? So context changes the meaning here for us. So when people say, I just know they're guilty, what they really mean is I've seen enough frames that fit my expectation, right? That's how bias dresses itself up as intuition. Now, I'm not saying that they're not. I'm just saying I feel like, you know, it could go either way with the Ramseys, but I don't know. Let's watch this next part.
Barbara adjusts the stack of papers in her lap. The cameras reset, the tension doesn't. What has already been said feels heavy enough, but there are still questions the world hasn't stopped asking. The ransom note, the strange details in the house, the contradictions that don't fit neatly into either innocence or guilt. The public can't let them go. She leans forward again, lowering her voice as if to draw something honest from exhaustion. Let's talk about the note, she says. John shifts slightly. Patsy straightens her shoulders. Everyone watching knows this is the piece that haunts the investigation. The 3 pages of careful handwriting on paper from Patsy's own pad, written with a pen from her own desk. The message begins formally, almost theatrical, asking for a ransom that matches the amount of John's Christmas bonus almost to the dollar. Barbara asks the question no one can answer. If the writer truly meant to take the child, why leave both the letter and the body behind? Why spend so long composing a message inside the house at all? John's explanation is patient, practiced. Whoever did this, he says, wanted to leave as little trace as possible. They used what was in front of them. They must have been waiting inside already, watching the family come and go. He says it was meant to be a kidnapping that went terribly wrong, an act of panic. Barbara studies him as he speaks. Her eyes never leave his face. She asks whether he believes the note was written before or after the child was taken from her room. John says before he thinks the person came prepared, planning every step, even if the plan fell apart. Patsy adds softly that experts examined her handwriting. Some said there were similarities, others said there were none. The results were inconsistent, she says, and none of them conclusive. She reminds Barbara that law enforcement later admitted those similarities had been overstated in the press. Her tone is careful, measured, as if she knows each word will be dissected. Barbara listens, but the questions keep circling. The paper, the pen, the hours of time it would have taken. Only you two had the opportunity, she says quietly. The sentence hangs in the air. Patsy looks up, her voice trembling slightly. If we wanted to hide something, she says, why would we write a note that points right back to our own house? It doesn't make sense. Barbara lets the silence stretch. The sound of the studio is almost nothing. The quiet click of a camera lens adjusting focus, the hum of lighting equipment overhead. Finally, she turns another page. You've said you believe someone waited inside for hours, she says. You'd been out that evening at a Christmas gathering. The theory is that the person entered then, maybe through a window, maybe while you were gone. But do you realize how difficult that is for people to accept? That a stranger could be inside your home for so long, unnoticed, and no one would wake up. John nods slowly. He says he understands, but it's the only explanation that fits for him. He says there was a broken window in the basement, one he had accidentally damaged months before. It had never been properly repaired. He says there was even a suitcase positioned beneath it, as if someone might have used it to climb out. To him, that's proof someone else was there. Barbara asks whether police found signs of forced entry. John says there were marks on the window and debris on the sill, but investigators dismissed them. They focused instead on the family. He sounds tired, frustrated, like a man who has repeated this same defense hundreds of times. Patsy adds that she and John cooperated in every way they could, that they turned over clothing, handwriting samples, everything requested. What they didn't expect, she says, was to become the story themselves, to be treated not as victims but as suspects. Barbara's tone stays neutral, but the edge is still there. The world saw your television appearances, she says. Many thought your grief looked rehearsed. They said you seemed defensive, even cold. Patsy exhales sharply. We were in shock, she says. People react differently. There's no right way to act when your whole world changes overnight. Her eyes flick downward. I prayed for strength every day. Maybe that looked like calm to someone else, but it was the only way I could breathe. The words settle like dust. John leans in, voice low. People think we controlled the situation, he says. They don't understand that from the moment we called the police, nothing was ever in our control again. The footage cuts to archival clips, the snow-covered house cordoned with police tape, the endless news vans outside, the headlines scrolling across television screens, narrators and reporters rehashing every inconsistency, every facial expression, every rumor. The story was no longer theirs. It belonged to everyone. Back in the interview, Barbara revisits the polygraph tests, pressing for details. John explains again that the first set was inconclusive, that they took another later with a different examiner and passed. He says they did it to clear their names. Barbara asks why they waited years to retake it. Patsy answers quietly that the initial tests were arranged privately without their attorney's guidance and that they were told afterward the results couldn't be trusted. They wanted it done correctly. Barbara nods, unconvinced but polite. Do you think the public will ever believe you? She asks. Patsy doesn't answer immediately. She looks at John, then back at Barbara. Maybe not, she says, but that doesn't make the truth any different. For a moment, neither of them moves. The room feels smaller, the light harsher. Barbara sets her papers aside. She tells them she's going to ask about their son. The question is simple but dangerous. Why didn't Burke speak publicly for so long? John answers that Burke was a child, that he had already been through enough. Investigators questioned him extensively, he says, and cleared him. There was no reason to expose him to more. Barbara asks whether he ever took a lie detection test. John says he doesn't believe so, not officially. It wasn't appropriate at his age. The answer only feeds more speculation. As he speaks, Patsy's face changes again. Protective, defensive, a mother's instinct flickering through fear. She says the idea that their son could be involved is the cruelest rumor of all, that it has hurt him every day since. Barbara listens carefully, then asks the question she's been building toward. What if this case is never solved? How do you live with that? John's eyes drop. He says he has learned to carry uncertainty, that faith and time are the only things keeping him from despair. He says he believes someone knows the truth, and someday it will come out. Patsy's expression softens again. We have to believe that, she says. If we don't, then the darkness wins. The interview pauses for a commercial break. But in the control room, no one speaks. The conversation has taken on the rhythm of something that doesn't end. It loops back again and again through the same unanswered questions. When they return, Barbara addresses the audience directly. She reminds viewers that no one has ever been charged, that evidence remains disputed, that the Ramseys continue to insist they had no part in what happened. She thanks them for coming, then looks back to John and Patsy with a faint, sympathetic smile. "You know this won't be the last time you're asked these questions," she says. Patsy nods. "I know," she replies, "but maybe one day people will listen differently." The camera lingers on their faces for several seconds. Two people locked forever in the same moment, defending themselves to a world that may never let them stop. The credits fade in over the quiet hum of the studio. Outside, the streets of Boulder are still covered in memory. The house stands unchanged. Reporters still reference it whenever the story resurfaces, a reminder that the case remains open, that time hasn't erased suspicion. Back in the present, as the lights dim, Barbara gathers her notes. The studio empties. For everyone else, it's another interview finished, another story filed away. For John and Patsy, it's another day trapped inside the same endless conversation, their names forever tied to an unsolved winter mystery.
So I think now this section exposes one of the most predictable human reactions to uncertainty, right? The realization loop. Once we decide what we believe, then our brains are going to start defending it like it's territory, right? So every new piece of information that gets filtered through the story, we've already chosen, okay? That's cognitive dissonance in real time. And it drives both the investigators and the audience, okay? So look at that note, the pen, the paper, right? All of these things might be evidence that was supposed to clarify everything, right? Instead, it just made the divide deeper, right? For people convinced of guilt, those details are going to confirm it for them, right? For people who are convinced of innocence, they prove incompetence by the police, all right? So both sides bend the same facts to protect their worldview. It's essentially mental self-preservation, right? Or some form of it, even if it's not all the way there, right? So the human brain, as you might know, can't really stand ambiguity, all right? So when closure doesn't come, it begins to invent closure. And that's why you see Barbara Walters, by the way, fantastic interview. You see Miss Walters really pressing the issue, really making sure that we're seeing and we're looking, hey, these are the questions that need to be asked. She's fighting against uncertainty itself, not just their answers, okay? And you see John and Patsy reacting very carefully, with very careful composure, because they've learned that emotion can be weaponized against them. And you even see that now with Patsy, God rest her soul, I should say. But John is very much the same way, in my opinion. He's very much the same way now. So this isn't just an interview. I feel like it's a case study in how humans process chaos. We build logic around emotion, and then in some instances, we like to call it reason. But let's go on to the next clip.
The next morning, television screens across the country replayed the interview in full. Every news outlet dissected it frame by frame, analyzing pauses, tone, posture, and every fleeting expression. For some viewers, the Ramseys appeared calm and sincere. For others, they looked rehearsed, too careful. Each side saw what it wanted to see. The truth remained buried somewhere between those interpretations. In the weeks after the broadcast, experts revisited the same old questions: the ransom note, the handwriting analysis, the timing of events that night. The note itself seemed to mock logic, 3 pages written on paper from Patsy's own pad, the wording both formal and erratic, and an amount demanded that matched a figure from John's business bonus almost exactly. It was too specific to be random, yet too theatrical to be professional. Even handwriting experts disagreed. Some saw faint similarities to Patsy's script, while others dismissed the comparison entirely. None could prove who had written it, and that uncertainty kept the case suspended in endless debate. Investigators argued that the family's statements didn't align with the evidence. Supporters countered that law enforcement had mishandled the scene from the beginning. Dozens of officers and friends had walked through the house that morning, contaminating nearly everything that could have offered answers. By the time the evidence team arrived, footprints had been erased, fingerprints overlapped, and time had erased what might have been vital clues. Inside the Ramsey home, Christmas decorations still hung untouched. The gifts remained scattered beneath the tree, ribbons half unraveled, reminders of a day that was supposed to end differently. Friends and relatives described a sense of paralysis, the family rarely leaving the house, the phone ringing endlessly with reporters seeking statements, the police asking the same questions on repeat. John, a quiet executive before all of this, had become the reluctant face of a national tragedy. Patsy, once poised and radiant, now looked worn from sleepless nights and constant accusation. When the cameras weren't rolling, she spent hours sifting through letters from strangers, some offering comfort, others cruelty. For every person praying for them, another accused them outright. Burke, barely 10 years old, was kept far from the spotlight. He resumed school later under a different last name, escorted by security for a time. His teachers described him as polite and quiet, the kind of child who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Even at his age, he understood that his family's name carried a shadow that would never fully lift. The following spring, a grand jury convened in Boulder to review the case. The proceedings were sealed, the evidence re-examined. Rumors spread that the panel had considered indicting one or both parents, but that the district attorney declined to file charges, saying there wasn't enough to proceed. The Ramseys called it vindication. Critics called it privilege. No one could prove anything, and nothing changed. When the Ramseys spoke publicly afterward, their tone was calm but defiant. John emphasized faith and forgiveness. Patsy pleaded for people to keep searching for whoever was responsible. Over the years, she would grow thinner, quieter, her energy fading as illness returned. Even so, she continued to attend memorial services and interviews, repeating her innocence in every appearance. "Someone knows," she said once during a local news broadcast. "Someone out there knows what happened." Her words became a refrain, half prayer, half challenge. The public, however, had already moved on to new headlines, new mysteries. Yet the Ramsey case never truly left the cultural consciousness. It reappeared every few years in documentaries, talk shows, and late-night debates on message boards and social media. Everyone had a theory. No one had the truth. Years later, retired investigators would admit that mistakes had been made. Evidence had been mishandled, and early assumptions had shaped every decision afterward. Some believed too much focus on the family blinded authorities to other possibilities. Others insisted the answer had always been within the house. Both sides clung to their interpretations as though certainty could rewrite history. John later said he believed the real story might never be known in his lifetime. He remarried quietly after Patsy's passing and rarely spoke publicly again. When he did, he emphasized forgiveness over anger. "You can spend your life being bitter," he told an interviewer once, "or you can try to find peace, but peace doesn't mean forgetting." His voice had aged, softer now, almost detached, as though he had learned to live beside the ache instead of inside it. Burke, now grown, appeared on television only once as an adult. His smile was polite, but his eyes betrayed discomfort, the weight of carrying a story he didn't create. When asked how he coped, he said he had learned to focus on what couldn't be taken from him. His memories of his sister before the world turned her into a headline. The city of Boulder eventually moved on, but the case never closed. Over time, it became less an investigation and more a mirror, reflecting the public's fascination with tragedy, wealth, and suspicion. The story wasn't just about a family anymore. It was about perception, about how easily people decide who deserves compassion and who deserves blame. Even decades later, theories continued to multiply. Some insisted an outsider had broken in and acted alone. Others maintained the tragedy was an accident that spiraled into panic and cover-up. Every new program claimed fresh evidence, yet every revelation led back to the same circle of doubt. Barbara Walters herself revisited the interview years later in a retrospective segment. She called it one of the most difficult conversations of her career. They were either the most wrongly accused couple I'd ever met, she said, or they were the most convincing. She paused, letting that ambiguity linger, and then added, "Either way, it's a story about how much we think we know and how little we ever really do." Footage from that day still circulates, the Ramseys sitting beneath the harsh lights, Barbara leaning forward, the air tight with accusation and restraint. Viewers watch, rewind, and argue the same questions all over again. Did their eyes flicker at the wrong moment? Did their answers sound too prepared? Was the pain real or practiced? Time has not provided clarity, only distance. The house in Boulder still stands, but repainted, its windows replaced, but the echoes remain. Neighbors say the air around it feels heavy, as if the past refuses to release its grip. Tourists still slow their cars to glimpse it through the tree, drawn by a mystery that has outlived nearly everyone who first told it. When the lights faded on Barbara Walters' set that night, the audience saw only two parents defending themselves. Off camera, she watched them leave the studio quietly, walking side by side down the corridor. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The sound of their footsteps was enough, a rhythm of people who had spent years walking through the same endless conversation, each step echoing a question that still has no answer. And that's where the story remains, in the silence between what's known and what's believed, a tale retold so many times that it has become legend, and legend turned to myth. Beneath it all, one truth endures. Whatever happened in that house on that December night, the world has never stopped trying to understand it, and perhaps it never will.
So, by the final act, this case stops being about, I would say, crime and becomes a lesson in how empathy erodes over time, okay? So once the story is entering the media cycle, it obeys the laws of emotional economics, right? Attention replaces compassion as the main currency. Does that make sense? So the public starts consuming the story instead of feeling the story, okay? Every documentary, every exclusive, quote unquote, becomes a transaction between curiosity and fatigue, right? So what you're seeing here is empathy inflation. The longer a tragedy remains unsolved, the more emotional energy it demands to stay relevant. So you really have to be invested in this in order for it to stay relevant. We've really got to solve this, right? The audience compensates by shifting focus from sympathy to speculation, from care to critique. That's why decades later, people are still debating the case, but rarely talking about the loss, right? I know we talk about it, but who did it? Why? For what? How could this have happened? So many theories. The human mind doesn't hold empathy at full volume forever. It converts it into theory, right? So when John is talking about peace instead of justice, right? That's emotional framing. It's a survival mechanism that lets someone keep living without resolution. Okay. Now, on that note, some theories suggest that John already knows. So he's not actually living without resolution. Burke is not actually living without resolution. Allegedly. Allegedly. Okay. It's the mind's way of creating stability when truth never arrives. All right. So in the end, I feel like there's another aspect to the story. It's not just about what happened in that house. I feel like it's about us. It's about how humans chase certainty, how we assign guilt through optics, and how we mistake confidence for truth, right? So I feel like the deeper lesson here is behavioral. So when answers run out, perceptions take their place, and perception, once formed, almost never lets go. So I just wanted to look at it from that lens. I know it's probably something a little bit different, but let me know what your comments are. Let me know what your thoughts are and your theories. This is a really fascinating case study.